Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today we'll talk about how to improve diversity in companies with provision of work from home opportunities for adults with disabilities. Now, let's talk about adults with disabilities. They are a really untapped labor pool for many situations. The US government finds that 50 million Americans, who are 15% of the population, are currently living with disabilities, making them by far the largest minority group as such. And they're often overlooked in hiring practices, despite the CEO desires for more talent from minority populations. And thinking about accommodations for people with disabilities, now there's a lot of executives who are concerned about the extra investments for necessary accommodations. But there was a study by the Economic Innovation Group that showed that the only accommodation that might be needed is simply remote work for people with disabilities. Let's talk about that. So the disabled and non-disabled people face similar job market conditions. Early on in the pandemic, there was a sharp drop in employment there for both people with disabilities and people without disabilities, followed by a slow increase. Now, quarter two compared to pre-pandemic, let's talk about that. Quarter two of 2022 compared to pre-pandemic. There were 3.5% more disabled people who are aged 25 to 54 who were employed in quarter two of 2022 compared to before the pandemic. But non-disabled adults, there were 1.1% less likely to be employed. So we saw that they faced similar situations, non-disabled people and disabled people at the start of the pandemic, and then they both recovered. But the disabled people with disabilities recovered their employment, recovered much quicker, and actually went above what was the case before the pandemic, whereas people without disabilities actually stayed lower by 1.1% less likely to be employed in quarter two 2022 compared to before the pandemic. So this is just because of remote work, but it's pretty clear that it helped disabled people to get and hold jobs. This was a long-standing request by disabled people. So Thomas Foley, who is the executive director of the National Disability Institute, states that workers with disabilities long sought remote work before the pandemic, and they just kept hearing no from executives. And so remote work during the pandemic definitely helped people with disabilities. We also need to think about the economic impact of long COVID. And that is a big issue. So the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said that about 19% of those who had COVID developed long COVID. And recent Census Bureau data showed that 16 million working-age Americans suffer from long COVID, with economic costs, they estimate, of 3.7 trillion. That's an unimaginably large number. I mean, considering the whole American GDP is about 20 trillion, that's a huge hit to our GDP. So, let's talk about employment status. There was a study by the Federal Bank Reserve of Minneapolis which found that 25% of long COVID patients changed employment status or working hours. So we can think about long COVID. Some of it is not going to be so impactful. I mean, I had COVID myself, and I know for me, I didn't have long COVID. My wife had COVID as well, and it took her several weeks to recover physically from her fatigue. So she had more in that not quite long COVID. Long COVID is supposed to be more than a month after, so it was probably a little bit more than a month after, but she recovered. But a number of other people don't recover, and some long COVID symptoms are not too bad. For example, anosmia, where you lack the sense of smell and taste. I mean, that's very bad in terms of internal personal suffering, not able to enjoy life's experiences, but it's not going to majorly impact your ability to do your work. However, 25% of long COVID status patients did change their employment status or their working hours. So 4 million people's ability to work is affected by long COVID, and many qualified as disabled. So there was a study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which found that there was a 1.7 million increase in US people with disabilities. So that's a huge increase, 1.7 million. And this growth mainly came from long COVID conditions like fatigue and brain fog. This is huge. This is a huge hit to our productivity. So brain fog has to do with difficulties with concentration or memory. And 1.3 million report increased brain fog since mid-2020. So that's a huge amount of people who are having difficulty concentrating, have difficulty with memory, which impacts negatively their ability to do their work. Remote work. Let's talk about its impact on the long COVID labor force. Many had to drop out of the labor force due to long COVID, but about 900,000 newly disabled people continue working. So 800,000 out of that 1.7 million dropped out. 900,000 continue working. In part, a lot of that is due to remote work. Without remote work, they may not have been able to continue working. That's huge. There's also the Federal Reserve Bank of New York study says a legal aspect to it, that the Americans with Disabilities Act can consider long COVID a disability in cases where telework, remote work is an accommodation, like for fatigue and brain fog. So employers who are covered, employers with over 15 staff and or government agencies must make reasonable accommodations. Teleworking and a flexible schedule is a reasonable accommodation for workers with fatigue and brain fog. And we also, of course, have diversity benefits of employing disabled adults. We know that there's extensive research showing that improving diversity boosts decision-making and financial performance. And companies offering flexible work definitely see a big boost in diverse hires. So for example, let's talk about Meta platforms, what used to be called Facebook. It decided to offer permanently remote work options, fully remote work options, and it very quickly saw increased diversity results. So it made a plan for its diversity goals in 2019 for 5 years, so 5-year plan for diversity goals. So it was supposed to, have certain outcomes by 2024. Nobody knew about the pandemic right then. And early on in the pandemic, it decided to offer fully remote work. And so it saw very huge boosts in its diversity populations of Black people, Hispanic, Alaskan, Native American veterans and women. It reached by 2022, early 2022, it reached its 2024 goals in a number of aspirations, like for hiring Black people and Hispanics in the US and women around the globe. And it also saw a big boost in employees with disabilities, who increased from 4.7% of Meta's employees to 6.2% from 2019 to 2022. That's a pretty huge boost. So it increased by 1.5%. And that's huge considering it was 4.7%. So that's about, that is a quarter more people with disabilities who you didn't have before compared to the proportion of your workforce, which is huge. And that, from what the people in charge of hiring diverse talent, so the chief diversity officer at Meta say, that is due to the remote work, where people who are underrepresented from minority groups were much more likely to apply for remote work positions than for in-person positions. And so that's how, and they got all that talent from companies like Apple and Google and so on that were less willing to be flexible and offer remote work. And success stories, let's talk about those. So my consulting for 21 companies in hybrid remote work crucially showed that there is increased recruitment and retention of disabled staff. So that's Meta Platforms in its report. From my consulting, I very clearly see that disabled staff are it helps to retain them and recruit them. So including those with long COVID symptoms, mobility challenges, and weakened immune systems who are hesitant to come to the office due to COVID risks. So all of those folks are definitely more likely to work for your company if you give them full-time remote work or mostly remote work. Some people, disabled people, do like to come to the office occasionally in order to socialize, connect with people, but there's going to be a whole bunch who want full-time remote work, and it's very important to offer to them if you want to recruit them and retain them. Now, that unfortunately is a challenge from a perspective of some biases that a lot of executives have. So many leaders overlook remote work benefits for underrepresented groups like people with disabilities because of in-group bias, which is a mental blind spot, a cognitive bias, causing leaders to focus on the concerns of those they perceive as part of their in-group, so people who are not living with disabilities, and leads to really harmful statements and ludicrous statements. For example, JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon said that returning to the office will aid diversity. I mean, that's absolutely not the case. It very much harms the diversity benefits of people with disabilities and also of other folks, like, let's say, women who need to be much more often caretakers. It harms their ability to work for your company. Black people have a much higher desire to work much more time remotely than white people because, on average, of course, if we're talking about averages, and so because Black people still report that they face microaggressions and discrimination in the office. And so there's much higher desire to spend much more time working remotely, where they face much less discrimination and microaggressions. Another two cognitive biases that are dangerous. One is called the empathy gap. So it's a difficulty with empathizing with those who aren't part of your in-group, like the people who are disabled, whether they're employees or prospective hires. It's difficult for employers to empathize with them. And for other people with disabilities, like, for example, Black people being discriminated against and women needing to be caretakers, if the leader happens to not be a woman. Unfortunately, we still have too few women in top leadership roles. And the omission bias. It's a perception that failure to act is less problematic than acting. For example, executives see the lack of support for people with disabilities as insignificant. That lack of support is not significant. And that's a big problem with the omission bias. And so there's a big cost to ignoring remote work for people with disabilities, because that really harms the bottom line. It limits your talent pool by 15%. It harms your ability to recruit and retain diverse candidates, and it puts organizations in potential legal hot water for violating the ADA. And there's a competitive advantage for offering remote work to people with disabilities, because that allows companies to recruit underrepresented candidates, expand their talent pool by 15%, and lower the costs of labor while increasing diversity. So that's why the future belongs to companies that offer such flexibility. All right, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to leave a review. It really helps other folks discover the show and helps us learn how you like the show and improve the show based on your feedback. And please make sure to subscribe to the channel wherever you check this out, on YouTube, on iTunes, wherever you check this out. All right, everyone. I look forward to seeing the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. In the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.